Welcome back to another episode of your Hope-Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in your God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I'm so glad when you choose to spend a few minutes of your week with us. Today, I'm joined by my son, Blake Bengtson, and today we're talking about a really important topic that I think, if we were honest, engenders a lot of fear in people. Today, we're going to be talking about how to share your faith with others in a natural way. God tells us to go to all the ends of the earth. And he says that it's his desire that none would perish, not even one. So we have a responsibility to share our Christian faith with others while we still have the time. Blake and I have had several conversations about how he has just done this naturally, and it's really encouraged my heart. So that's why I've invited him on the podcast today. Welcome to the episode, Blake.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You, at the core, I think, really have an evangelist heart. Although I'm not sure that you would have necessarily said that about yourself, but when I hear about your experiences, when I hear about your conversations, I think, he's got that evangelist heart. And I just wonder, what was it that started cultivating in you a desire to share your faith with people?
Well, I think first and foremost, looking back at my childhood, I was raised in a nominally Christian household. Both my parents were strong believers and practiced Christian practices with my brother and I growing up. So we were in church every week, and we prayed before meals, and we read Bible stories at night and allegories that related to Bible stories, like the Chronicles of Narnia, at night. And so I had that growing up. And then when I went off to college, when it kind of became my responsibility to get myself up and to go find a church and to get to church because no one was going to wake me up if I slept in. My faith really kind of became my own when I got to college, and that was almost a decade ago now. But and then I got involved in a college ministry, and one of the big focuses of that particular college ministry was evangelism. We were um, practicing evangelizing towards students who maybe didn't have a worldview set in stone yet. Lots of students who were leaving the home and flying the nest for the first time and looking for an explanation for the world around them, something to cling to as they looked for hope and as they looked for something to identify themselves with. And we were presenting the natural, healthiest, best option as Christianity. So I had a lot of practice doing that. And since graduating college a handful of years ago, I have moved into a job in the professional workforce where I am around adults who now have a set worldview, and my practice of evangelism has had to change from inviting people who are seeking a worldview to adopt the worldview of Christianity and pursue our loving God and Savior while they were just looking for a way to
Hmm.
identify themselves. And that
Yeah.
was an easy invitation to now discussing with strangers and coworkers who have a set worldview and who have set opinions on Christianity, which has definitely been a shift. It's been different from just presenting this as, hey, this is this wonderful thing that you can adopt and you can be a part of, to now having conversations with people about their own worldviews and how maybe their worldviews are inconsistent with the way the world actually is, and how Christianity is actually a more consistent worldview and a more truthful worldview compared to how the world is and how people operate.
And I sometimes I think it depends on our approach. If we attempt to shove the gospel down people's throats and we tell them that you are a sinner and you need to be saved, I think sometimes our approach can make the difference of whether it opens the door or it shuts the door. And you have developed, I think, from some influence of others, a unique way of opening the door with questions. And people love to talk about themselves in general. Not all of us, but in general, I think people like to talk about themselves. So share a little bit about how you even open the door to talk about the gospel.
Sure. So I think there's the stereotypical line that you often see from certain offshoots of Christianity where you say, "Hi, my name is Blake. Do you know about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ?" And I don't know that that approach has legitimately worked for me in any permutation since I was involved in the college ministry. Maybe there was some times in the college ministry where I could say, "My name is Blake. Tell me a little bit about your life. I would love to tell you about the opportunity to be accepted where someone was seeking acceptance, or to not have to seek power and control over others where people might have been doing that." But I don't think that's something that has been a legitimately not profitable, but a legitimately fruitful strategy
Hmm.
since I've been in the college ministry. I think these days it is important to ask people about themselves and to ask people about their beliefs. And even when people aren't comfortable talking about themselves, people are generally willing to talk about their hobbies and their beliefs about the
Yeah.
world and how the world operates and how the world should operate. And I had a pastor share with me a couple of years ago as I was talking about trying to evangelize on the job and with strangers that I meet. In the job that I work with a handful of coworkers, but I also have the opportunity to meet lots of strangers,
Hmm.
lots of people that I've never met before and may never meet again, even if they're coworkers, not coworkers. And as I was sharing with him my efforts to evangelize with people, which can be difficult, because even if it's true that we're sinful and there's a solution to the sin and we can be forgiven for it, people don't care about the sin if they don't think that the God that says these things are sin exists, or they don't think that God has any impact over their life or over what happens after their life. And so it's not until you get people to a place where they recognize this God is real and he does have an impact on our life and what happens after our life that they care about what he says is sin and what he says is wrong. So anyway, that said, I had a pastor share with me a couple years ago as I was talking about evangelizing. He kind of just mentioned offhandedly. He goes, Blake, I think people, all people, especially non-Christians and especially atheists and agnostics, struggle with questions of there's four questions that he shared. He goes, people struggle with questions of who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? And how am I supposed to treat other people while I'm here? And where am I going? And it's really, I mean, this deals with questions of the origin of not just who we are as an individual person, but the origin of humanity,
Hmm.
morality as humans, where we go is some afterlife. These are questions that everybody struggles with. Even Christians have to find answers to. Our answers are thankfully found conveniently in a book that we study as Christians, but
Right.
these are questions that are difficult for people
Yeah.
who are not Christians. And so these are avenues that not only do I focus my questions on, but the same pastor shared with me, he goes, I think any conversation is probably two or three good questions away from landing on one of these questions.
Mm.
And so I like to focus on questions in my conversations with strangers and coworkers that allow us to point back towards these questions.
Over time, have you had mixed results? Or generally have these questions led to a fruitful conversation? Not necessarily that they've always led people to Jesus, but have they opened their mind to maybe thinking further beyond your conversation?
Generally, I would say most of the time, these conversations lead to some sort of further deep thought from the
Hmm.
people I'm talking to. I don't know that I've had a conversation yet in the handful of years that I've been out of the college ministry and attempting these conversations where at the end of an hour conversation with a complete stranger, someone goes, "You know what? I think you're completely right. I'm ready to follow Jesus." But I
But
don't,
it's not all, it's our job is to plant seeds
right.
and then someone else waters.
Right, and someone else sows or someone
Yes,
else reaps.
reaps.
Yes, and I mean I think Jesus is very clear about that in the Bible.
Yeah.
He even says some will sow and others will reap. So I don't think every conversation needs to end up at a point where someone is converting, and I think it would probably be not in every instance, but in plenty of instances, it would probably be counterproductive to try to force a conversion conversation where at the end of the conversation you follow through and go, "Are you ready to accept Jesus?" I think in some ways that could be counterproductive to force that conversation. If the conversation is naturally going there, great. But in my experience, trying to force that conversation can do more harm than good.
And I think by your approach, if it fosters more in-depth thought on their part,
Hmm.
They may pick up that conversation at a later time
Hmm.
with you or with someone else.
Right.
But basically, what you're trying to do through this question process that you engage them in is to get them to think beyond where they are today,
Hmm.
to maybe consider things that they haven't considered before. So, can you give us an example of kind of how this question trail might look?
Sure. Absolutely. So some of my most common question patterns or question trails tend to fall along the lines of morality and whether or not morality is an objective or a subjective, whether or not it's left up to some authority or higher power, if you will, that determines our morality and what is good and bad, or whether or
Mhm.
not it's a subjective or it's a personal decision that everybody gets to decide what's right and wrong. As well as I got married somewhat recently, and so I've been enjoying asking people, even strangers, what they think the purpose of marriage is.
Uh,
I think society defines marriage as one thing, and I think the Christian faith defines it as something much more substantive, that is much more defensible and much more clear cut about what is included in marriage and what is not.
mhm.
And so both of these conversation topics eventually segue into whether or not there's a God or a creator, an intelligent designer. And I think there's a case to be made that if there's a God or an intelligent designer, he must be monotheistic. There must be only one, and it must be the Christian God. But that's, I mean, that's a different line of questioning. But I recently had a conversation with someone who was a stranger a few months back, and this person had grown up in a household where an offshoot of Christianity was taught. I won't even say a Christian denomination, that would be an appropriate title for it, but it was a faith structure that had begun with the teachings of the Bible and then had added a lot to
Mm,
it. It's a common one
okay.
in the US, and that's what I'll leave it at. But this is someone who had grown up in that environment and seen the misuses of faith in that environment and the
Mm,
abuses of the church. And after his parents had walked away from that faith, he decided that it was not for him anymore either. And so I got a chance to have a conversation with him a couple of years after he had walked away. This was the first time that he and I had met. And we had some conversations, and I don't even remember what the lead-in question was, but some of my work is done not in the normal 9 to 5 stretch. Some of it is done early in the morning, late at night. And when it's done late at night, I have clear access to the sky or to a window, so where I'm able to look out at the stars. And one of my favorite ways to initiate some of these questions is I'll look out at the stars as I'm working with someone or talking to a stranger, and I'll ask, "Do you think there's anything up there?" And they'll answer something about whether or not they think there's life on other planets. And the natural next question for me, because again, I think any of these questions, any good conversation is probably 2 or 3 questions away from
right,
one of these questions that people struggle with is, okay, well, regardless of what answer they give, the natural next question is, I guess that begs the question, how do you think we came to exist? Because if they don't think there's alien life out there, which that's not for me to say, it's natural to ask how we got here because
right,
and if they do think there's life out there, it's also natural to ask how we came to
right.
exist because it's fair to assume that we came to exist the same way that intelligent life either did or didn't come to exist. And so that leads into a question about whether or not this particular person believes in some intelligent designer. And he starts sharing, I used to think there was, but I saw how my church responded to some of my parents' actions, and I just decided that a loving God would not have instituted a church system that responded that way, and so I just don't believe anymore that there's a God. And a line of questioning once you get to conversations about faith that I learned from the author Greg Koukl, last name spelled Koukl. He's an American Christian. Well, he's a Christian and an American apologist. And he kind of popularized these 3 questions of what do you mean by that? Why do you believe that? And then asking further questions to kind of not undermine, but kind of start to pick apart an incorrect view of the world. And so
Okay.
I start asking this particular individual questions about, well, what do you mean by that? Just trying to get some clarity, get him to
Mhm.
define what he means, and so that I can make sure that I understand what he means before I start addressing it. Because I don't want to
Well, and the thing about that is that people don't care what you have to say
Right,
until they know that you care. And by even just asking the question, what do you mean by that? It shows that you have interest.
right,
You care
right.
about their beliefs and where they came from.
Right. And I think that that question is powerful and it serves multiple purposes
Hmm.
because when people have legitimate hurts, you don't want to just immediately jump to the Bible and go, well, you shouldn't have been hurt by that because that's not how God is.
Or God works all things together
Right,
for
right,
good.
right. Which
Yeah.
is true, and that's
Yep.
a helpful response for Christians who you're close to, and you know that that will hold some value to them. But for
Right.
someone who's not a Christian, that response will necessarily feel insensitive.
Yes.
And so to ask, what do you mean by that when you're discussing with someone who has legitimate hurts from the church or legitimate hurts from people who are Christians, further clarifies what their beliefs are,
Hmm.
which is helpful for you because you get an understanding of what you're actually responding to.
Right.
It gives you more time to develop a response. Certainly, as I
Sure.
practice these conversations with people, especially when you're beginning and having conversations about faith, you kind of are often struck with a deer in the headlights
Uh,
moment where you're like, I don't know what to say to
where
this.
do I go with
Right,
this?
where do I go
Yeah.
with this? So I'll offer some clarification to you before you jump in with
Hmm.
them and before
Hmm.
you put your foot in your mouth and you respond in a way that's going to be counterproductive. And when people are going along with the bandwagon of bashing Christianity and it's not based on some hurt that they have or what they're sharing with you is not specific to some hurt they have, if they're just throwing out some slogan that they've heard some political party or some social agenda push out about, Christianity is evil, Christianity is genocidal, Christianity, whatever, asking, what do you mean by that? Really
Hmm.
forces them to define what they mean because it's too easy for them to throw out one of these slogans that bashes Christianity, and we should expect people to do that as Christians. The Bible tells us that if people came against Christ and his message, they're going to come
Right.
against us when we share his message.
Right.
So while we should expect that, if people bash Christianity and the message of Christ and we just try to defend it immediately, they might switch their attack point and go, yeah, but that's not really what I meant. So by asking, what do you mean by that? You are giving yourself more time to prepare a response. You are forcing the other person to specifically detail what they mean when they say something, and you're gathering further information about someone else's past and their hurts, which is an important thing to do
Hmm.
before you jump in with a response about Christianity. So that's the first question I start with. That's the first question I learned to ask is, what do you mean by that? Ask someone else for clarification. And sometimes that one question will cause someone else's objection to Christianity to fall apart, especially when it comes to someone who doesn't have a personal hurt in the area that they're throwing out. When it comes to anti-Christian. I mean, I call them slogans. They're not like you don't see them like in commercials, but
Right.
these things that people commonly say but
Yeah.
aren't really substantive. You push them a little bit on it and it falls apart. They go, well, I mean, you know, you know what I mean.
No, I
No, I
don't
don't.
know. That's
Please
why
tell
I'm
me, what do you
asking
mean
you.
by that? I
Right.
want to understand. I want to respond to the right hurts. I want to respond to
Right.
the right objections, and I want to further understand you. So tell me what you mean. I would love to know. And there are different ways to ask the question of what do you mean by that? You can ask, what do you mean by that? I
Or
don't think I
help
understand.
me
Help me
understand that a
understand. I
little bit.
love help me understand.
Hmm.
That's actually one that I really enjoy using because it subtly shifts the impetus from the other person, and you kind of not pretending, but you're putting the impetus on you. You're kind of suggesting, I don't think I understand. I don't think there's anything wrong with the way
Right.
you communicated. I just didn't understand it. So if you could help me understand it, it really,
And
I find that helpful,
don't you
especially.
think it takes the emphasis off you having an agenda?
Right, right, right. So when you jump in immediately with, oh, the Bible works all things together, or you don't have a proper understanding of Christianity, people's walls are immediately going to go up. They're going
Right.
to go, whoa, whoa. I know what I believe. I disagree with what you're saying. I'm going to stop listening now.
Right.
They might
Right.
continue the
Yes.
conversation, but they have tuned out
Yeah.
minutes ago. When you throw something like that out, unless it's a close friend or close individual, but even still, I think these tactics are beneficial for these
Hmm.
conversations. So yeah, I think it keeps people's guard off and it prevents someone else from putting the impetus and the requirement on defense or on proof on you when they've made a claim. If someone says Christianity is genocidal or intolerant, if you immediately go, well, that's not true because X, Y, Z, you're letting them force you into the hot seat where you have to
Mhm.
offer a defense for Christianity.
And that's what I like about this approach is because it's question driven,
Right,
it's less of I have an agenda that I'm forcing you to listen to.
right.
Okay, so after you ask that question and you get some clarity about where they're really coming from,
Hmm.
where do you go from there?
Well, so the natural next question that I asked to this individual who said, I just couldn't believe in a God who would do that. I asked, well, what do you mean by that? And his response was something along the lines of, I couldn't believe in a God who his followers, his most adamant church-going followers would respond in this way to supposed sin.
Mhm.
And so I just had to ask him, the question was begged, you believed in God before, and the unfortunate response of the church to an incident or a behavior pattern led you to believe that there's not a God anymore? And he goes, yes. And so I asked him, how does that track? Why would you believe in God before, and the response of mortal beings who are inherently imperfect causes you to believe that there's not a higher power? And he kind of had this deer in the headlights look, and
Right.
I just,
But that is
it
common.
is common.
When the church has hurt, it is very common for people then to go, well, then I just can't believe in a God.
I don't want any part of that anymore. And
Right.
I can even understand how the hurt caused by a church or a Christian would cause someone to have that response. But when you look at it logically, it just doesn't track that you
Right.
would have a belief in a higher power and that you would be devoted to following them. And because someone who also believes in that higher power wronged you, you would suddenly believe, I mean, you're changing your entire worldview about how we came into being, how we ought to treat each other, where we go after we die because someone's hurt you. I mean, I can understand that, but it doesn't track.
Yeah.
And so I think calling that out in a way that's not offensive, in a way that's fundamentally defensive and inquisitive,
Mm-hmm.
asking
Mm-hmm.
questions and not going, well, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
Going,
Right.
I don't think I understand
Yep.
how you got to that conclusion given your experiences. Could you explain further?
And don't you think that when that happens, when there's a hurt and they kind of slam the door on even the existence of God, it's frequently they haven't even thought through that
I
process.
haven't thought through the
They are just
implications.
reacting in pain. And so your question then actually makes them contemplate, oh, how did I get here?
Yeah.
Okay, so then what happened?
So we kind of go through this conversation of, so now you believe there's no God. You believe there was a God, you got hurt by a mortal being, and now you believe there's no God, which, okay, I kind of expressed curiosity and a lack of understanding, which is the basis for these
Mm-hmm.
questions. It's not
Right.
yelling at someone, that doesn't make sense. It's genuinely being inquisitive and saying, that doesn't make sense to me, but I would love to understand where you're coming from. Can you explain
Mm-hmm.
that? And then we kind of move to this inquisitive line of questioning of, okay, so if you don't believe there's a God anymore, what's your basis for morality? What's your basis for why we ought to treat each other well? Because if there's no higher power that created us in his image, no higher power that is in charge of these rules and laws for how humans ought to treat each other, it's just subjective. It's just a matter of what people think is right and wrong. And I asked him, I was like, I understand why you would treat me well as a stranger who is professionally related or professionally adjacent to you, because if you mistreat me, that could have an implication for your job and your ability to provide. But so you're walking down the street and you see a stranger in front of you. I mean, what's to stop you from robbing them or kicking them in the shins? I mean, except for the response of our government, if you knew you could get away with something, what's to stop you or anyone else from being evil? And I say evil, but even evil is a
Uh-huh. Oh,
moral, is an
yes.
objective moral category.
So how do you respond to that?
We went back kind of back and forth with this question multiple times, and ultimately his response was, I guess you're right. If I'm to say that there's no God, I have to also say that there's no objective moral implication or no objective moral necessity to treat other people well. People could treat people however they want, and other people would only be able to say, I don't like that.
Hmm.
Because to say something is wrong is to make an objective moral judgment of it. But to say, I don't like that is to say, well, I think it's wrong, and I don't want people to do that, and I wouldn't do that, but I can't tell you not to do it. And that's kind of
Right.
what I raised to him. I
Right.
took I mean, sometimes I find it effective to take the most morally egregious acts in human history and kind of raise them. And I think we can all think of heinous things that have happened in human history. And I kind of raise some of these things to him, and I turn to him and I go, so are you saying then, if there's no higher power, if there's no objective morality, that these are all just things that we have to look at and go, I don't like that. It's not wrong, but I don't like it. And he goes, no, no, those things are absolutely wrong. It's beyond a subjective, I don't like it. Those things are wrong. And I go, okay, well, if it's wrong, what's the basis for that morality?
Okay.
And sometimes when I raise this line of questioning, people will throw out there, oh, well, it's the basis for human flourishing. If it goes against human flourishing, then it's wrong. But some of the most egregious acts in history have been committed by destructive leaders who were doing it in the name of human flourishing, in the name
Uh-huh.
of
Uh-huh.
cleansing a race of people, or
Right.
or removing some group of people that they thought were lesser than the rest of humans. And so it can't be the basis of human flourishing because different people have different standards of flourishing. Even different societies have
Hmm.
different standards of
Sure.
flourishing. I mean, even if you look back at human civilizations that weren't mass murderers, they still had different priorities as it was in terms of what human flourishing looks like. So kind of explain that. Well, I don't think it's fair to say that human flourishing is the standard of objective morality because people have done terrible things in the name of human flourishing, and then even different civilizations throughout history have had different standards of what a perfect civilization would look like and what human flourishing ought to look like. So you raise that, and that kind of defeats that one. And then the other one that I hear popularly is, are you saying that atheists and non-Christians can't be moral? And I think the very easy response to that is no, 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 no. That is not what I'm attempting to say. And that is
Okay.
that is a normal and even reasonable objection to a lack of objective morality without a higher power. The idea that there's no objective morality without a higher power, without an intelligent designer, without the Christian God, is not to say that some group of people who don't believe in him can't be moral. It's to say that there's no basis for being moral.
Okay.
So to say, I mean, because truthfully, atheists and agnostics and people of other religions are capable of being moral. They're capable of
Sure.
adopting people that need help. They're capable of giving to the poor. They're capable of protecting those in need. Those are
Hmm.
morally good things to
Hmm.
do. But the argument that I put forward is that those aren't good things without a higher power that offers some more substantial basis for the value of a human life besides human evolution. Because if we've
Okay.
all evolved from nothing, if we're all just molecules in motion, as I've heard Greg Koukl say, then I don't have any more value to any other human being than the meat they buy at the grocery store or the trees that they pass on their walk.
Okay.
We're all just collections of carbon atoms and molecules, and so there's no basis, objectively speaking, to treat me well.
Okay.
So I think that's the other thing that I'll hear people raise is, are you saying that atheists can't be moral? And that's not what I'm saying. That's not what you should say. That the truthful stance is that the things that people do that are good, morally speaking, cannot be considered good if there's no moral standard. And so that's kind of what I raise to some of the people that I interact with, strangers, as I'm doing my job, is that there is no basis for what is good and what is bad if there is no higher being, no intelligent designer, no loving creator. And so I raise these things and I explain this to this person who has decided to walk away from a faith structure that, again, was an offshoot of Christianity, was a misuse and an abuse of the Christian
Hmm.
teachings to
Yeah.
begin with. It was very understanding that people might walk away from that faith structure, which kind of definitely adds an extra element of, okay, so you've been hurt by the church who preaches a God, but this is not the church or the God,
Uh, uh,
which adds an element of needing to try to further understand and empathize with people's hurts. And so, I mean, that's ultimately where I went to with this particular individual is if you believe now that there's no God, and I told him, just for the record, I don't believe the God that your church preached, and I feel comfortable saying this since you've walked away from your church. I don't think your church is a legitimate iteration of the Christian church, and I don't think the God that your church preaches is a loving God, so I could understand why you would walk away from
sure.
him.
Hmm.
But we get to this point where I ask him, if you believe there's no God, where do you base morality? Where do you base, except for the fact that you and I work together, so take a random stranger that you're going to meet 3 days from now who you don't work with, why do you treat them well? And they kind of go, oh, it's human nature. I go, okay, but
But it's not. Human
yeah,
nature is
it's not.
innately selfish.
Right. And generally speaking, the next thing, some people stop there and go, you're right. I guess I never thought about that before. I've had half a dozen people say, I guess I have some more thinking to do. The
Hmm.
next common objection that I hear from people, if there's still further objections, is, well, we've just evolved. Human nature is a process of evolution to treat other humans well. And that's truthfully not a response that sits well with me. I don't think that's an honest response to morality because I don't think you see in any other species the desire to watch out for the sick and the poor outside of one's own familial structure or herd structure or flock structure or structure of immediate animals inside of however those animals are grouped out in the
Hmm.
wild. I mean, you see like a sick zebra might be taken care of by its other herd of zebra, but you don't see, generally speaking, a sick animal of another species being taken in by a healthy group of animals. And in some
The
instances,
lions are not
right,
going
the
to
lions are not
take
taking
in
in
the
sick
zebra.
zebras, but we
Right.
do that with sick animals. And then, I mean, it's not true within every group of animals. Some group of animals will take in any other sick animal from their species, no questions asked. But frequently, it's the case that a group of healthy animals that, be a pride or a herd won't take in a sick animal of that species if it's not from that herd.
Hmm.
So I kind of raised this idea
Hmm.
that I think humans are actually uniquely designed to care for the sick and the needy, even when it doesn't value us. Because that's the other thing you see with animals is even when they do take in the sick and the needy and the hurt and the injured, it's to further the survival of their own species. And I think uniquely you see humans doing that when it does not benefit them. And so I think to say, oh, well, human nature has evolved such that morality is necessary for human development, I don't think that's true at all.
No.
I think generally speaking, when you look in nature, you actually see other animals taking advantage of animals that are sick and needy and wounded and hurt and are on they're the last leg of their life. Generally speaking, you see nature taking advantage of that. You don't see nature supporting that and building it back up. So I think to say that humans, as a natural process of evolution, have developed a standard of morality, I don't think that's a fair I tell the people that I talk with, I don't think that's a fair stance to take. I don't think that you see that in any other animals that have supposedly evolved. So I raise that, and it kind of comes back to this. So if we didn't evolve it, where did it come from? If not a
Uh,
higher power, and if not a higher power, it actually didn't come from anywhere. It doesn't exist at all. So there's no standard for objective morality. And so that was the basis of my conversation with this individual who had walked away from this faith structure that was already an offshoot of
hmm.
healthy Christianity.
Hmm.
And, I interacted with him a couple times over the course of a few days, kind of adjacent to my job. And then I didn't interact with him again for months. And then a few months back, I interacted with him again. And again, kind of adjacent to my job. And I took a few minutes to recognize him. And then he and I got talking and we got catching up. And I asked him how he was doing. And he said, I remember you. Last time that we met, we talked about religion for a few days, and I kind of chuckled and I said, "Well, that sounds like me. If you gave me the chance to do that for a few days, I probably did that. I do love talking about it, and I think it's an important thing to talk about."
That's a good thing to be
That's a
remembered
good thing to be
for.
remembered. Yeah, we didn't talk about sports scores or anything like that for days. We talked about religion for a few days. And
Especially when you're coming at it from the standpoint of, "Hey, help me to understand where you've come from,
yeah,
as opposed to being remembered because you tried to cram the gospel down somebody's throat."
right,
Yeah.
right.
He remembered you because of your approach, I think,
Yeah,
because you truly sought to understand him.
right.
So, how did this follow-up conversation go?
It went way better than I expected. I was not, I did, it was really,
But that is the concern, is
right.
it not? Is I think frequently that what holds us back from sharing our faith is we're afraid of the reaction.
Sure,
We're afraid of the backlash. And so
sure,
even you saying it went better than I expected, you know, goes to our underlying like, oh, what's going to happen with this relationship
sure,
in the future?
sure.
And it went well. So tell us about
Yes.
that.
Well, so on the point of being nervous about how these either follow-up or initial conversations will go, there was this image that was presented to me when I was in the college ministry of a traffic light. And I think most of your viewers, probably regardless of where in the world they listen, unless they're astronauts who were born on the moon, which we don't have any of those yet, are probably familiar with the traffic light. So I think it's a good image of when you're having conversations about faith with other people, you have to judge whether or not their reactions are a green light, I'm so interested in what you're saying, please
Mhm.
tell me more, or a yellow light of, I understand what you're saying, I don't know if I want to have this conversation, or a
Right,
red light, you know what, I'm really not interested in having this conversation with you, and I prefer you don't bring it up in the future. And that's okay. You can't force conversations with
right,
people when they throw up a red light. It's again, it could be counterproductive. So
right,
I tend to find myself looking for the green and the yellow lights, which I generally think I find more of when I start with questions instead of
right,
sitting down and going, "Hi, my name's Blake. Can I talk to you about Jesus?"
right,
When I
right,
sit down and go, "Hi, my name's Blake. What's your name? Tell me about what you believe." And you can kind of start with these innocent questions. You don't, your first question of, "What do you believe about God?"
No, but sometimes it's even just tell me about your family.
Yeah,
Where'd you grow up?
yeah,
What was your home life like?
yeah, yeah.
And it's showing interest in them as a person.
Yes, it is.
And then you proceed from there.
Which I
Okay,
think
so
increases the chances of a green or yellow light. So
of
anyway,
course.
I run into this person a few months later, adjacent to work, and we're like, I remember you. We talked about religion for days, and I said that sounds like me. If you gave me the chance to talk about it, I'm sure I talked about it for days. And I asked him, so like, well, how has that gone for you? What have your thoughts about it been since that?
Hmm.
And he kind of shared. He goes, I honestly kind of had an identity crisis, and I've been reading the Bible since then. And that shook me. I
This is
was
someone who walked away from the church and
who walked away
decided that they
from
didn't believe
yes,
in God.
yes,
Reading the Bible?
yes, yes. And again, this is for anyone that may have been tuned out when I shared it earlier. This is someone who walked away from a church that is an offshoot of Christianity that
Uh-huh.
most Christians would agree this not this denomination. This faith structure does not share core doctrines about the Trinity, about salvation, about the nature of God and
Right,
Jesus and our
right.
nature as humans and what happens to
And
us
to
after
some
death.
degree, I think there was some spiritual abuse there.
Yes, yes. So he walked away from a church that does
Right,
not have proper views of God. He walked
right.
away from the God that that church preaches and is now taking an interest in Christianity and the Bible. And he's been reading the Bible. And so I asked him, I said, that's a big change from where you were. Last we talked, you had no interest in the church, no interest in God, no interest in the Bible, and here you are reading the Bible. What led to that?
Uh-huh.
Because the outset of our last conversation, it was, I don't think that I necessarily agree with you. So I asked him, I said, I gotta know. I have to know.
Sure.
I have to know what led to this. And he said, I was reflecting on our conversations about morality and the basis for why we treat each other well. And I just came to the conclusion that you were right. There's not a basis for objective morality and for people to treat each other well if there's not a higher power that is the governing authority of that morality.
And he had even had some conversations with other friends about this, right? So,
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't like he just took what you said and went,
I ran
oh,
with
I
it,
think that
right?
guy's right.
Right.
No, he reflected on it enough to even ask other people's opinions.
Right. Right. And so it wasn't even me diving into the Bible and going, well, the Bible says this, Bible says that
Right.
about Jesus or God, that convinced him. I just raised this idea about the basis or lack of basis of morality, depending on your view about a loving, creating God. And he said, I thought about it, I decided you were right, and then I either had to decide that there was no morality or that there was a God. And it didn't sit with me that there was no objective morality because, like we discussed, there are acts that people commit against one another historically or even in today's day and age that I can't look at and go, I don't like that. I look at these acts and I go, no, that is objectively wrong. People should not treat each other like that. It's not a preference of mine that people don't treat each other like that. It is inherently wrong when people treat each other like that. And so if I'm going to hold that view, I have to also hold the view that you're right. There's a source and there's a basis for morality, and that has to
Wow.
be a God. And he and I had had a conversation about if there's a God, it has to be the Christian God. And so that kind of led him to I've been reading the Bible, and he had some friends that had similarly walked away from this offshoot of Christianity who
Hmm.
had also turned back to the Bible over recent years. And so he had kind of reached out to them and been having conversations with them, and he shared that with me, and it was wonderful. It was exciting. A lot of the
Yeah.
times when I interact with these strangers, the people that I'm never going to get to meet again in my entire life. And so it was a treat and genuinely a blessing for me to get some feedback on a conversation that I had had because I'm left not knowing
Right.
how many people do I have conversations with that I legitimately shift their way of thinking back towards, or initially for the first time, towards God as a loving creator who does exist, and the Bible as a legitimate collection of not only history but poetry about God and the nature of humanity that I'll never know about. I'll never know about the effect that I have on these people, which is fine. I think in some senses I would probably be tempted to be prideful if I knew about all the successes that came from that, but it was definitely a blessing to me. It was a gift from God for me to get
For
to
sure.
know the impact, the small impact that I had on pointing someone back towards him. And the latest that I was aware of this individual is, it's my understanding that he has not come back towards the Christian faith, but he is very, very curious about what the Bible teaches and about who God is and how we ought to relate to him. I think he understands now that if he is to believe that there is objective morality, he must also believe that there is a God. And I think based on he and I's conversations, he has decided that it has to be a monotheistic God. And of the major monotheistic faiths, the Christian faith made the most sense to him. And so he's been pursuing reading the Bible slowly. And I hope that I get a chance to to meet him again through work and kind of ask where he is. I've
Mhm.
reached out to him a couple times and not gotten responses, which is fine. I mean, it's we didn't have an excessively social relationship.
Right.
I'm just kind of
Right.
curious how he's doing. I've been praying for him. I hope he's doing well, and I hope that he's continued with his Bible studying. And so that's been my experience. I've had a handful of experiences like that. That was the only experience I had where there was a follow-up with someone
Yeah.
after that conversation. But I've had, at this point, probably dozens of conversations with people about objective morality, the basis of marriage as an institution, excuse me, the origin of life. I mean, maybe not many things, probably a handful or half a dozen topics that I feel comfortable using as a lead-in for discussions about faith.
And you may never know if he comes to Christ until you get to heaven.
Right,
But you planted seeds, and here's where we pray for his heart and his mind to be open to the truth
right.
from the Holy Spirit and the fact that he's in the Word, which we know is alive and active. That's where the Holy Spirit then takes the little seeds that you planted, the questions that you pose to him,
Hmm.
and hopefully through his reading and his interaction with other believers over the course of time, he will come to know the Lord. And then maybe he will start planting seeds in the
Hmm.
minds of other people. So I don't think we will know, but until we get to heaven. But I think when we get to heaven, God's gonna show us,
I hope so.
that day that you were kind to that person when they were really
Yeah.
struggling. here's the difference it made.
Hmm.
It planted this seed, which was then watered by this person, which was then,
Right.
harvested by this. I think God will show us because it's to his glory. But I think you're right. Sometimes we won't know here on earth because we could become prideful, thinking it was my efforts that made the difference. No, it was the leading of the Holy Spirit, and you were obedient.
Sure. Yes.
So as we wrap up this episode, Blake, if someone's really resonating, going, "Wow, I really struggled to share my faith," what hope-filled perspective would you want to leave them with? Because you did not develop this overnight. It's been a practice
Hmm.
and you're fine-tuning it, and every person is different. But what encouragement would you want to give to our listeners who have been a little reticent to share their faith?
I think that what I would like to offer to anyone who is either starting or struggling to continue in this process of sharing faith is that you don't have to get to a point where you're closing the deal in every conversation.
Mhm.
In fact, most conversations, in my experience, are not going to be conversations where you're getting to the altar call. You're asking someone if they're
Right.
ready to receive Christ. And all the conversations that I've had, I can count, on one hand the number of times that I've asked that question to someone. So don't feel like you've got to force that every time.
Hmm.
And the other thing I would like to offer is that taking the perspective of asking questions and trying to understand people's beliefs allows you to keep them in the hot seat and allows
Hmm.
you to require them to offer an explanation for their beliefs. Because again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, when people throw out these things that are not true about Christianity, oftentimes Christians, our natural response is to think I have to defend
Yeah.
Christianity.
Yeah.
But I think it is helpful. It has been helpful in my experience too, when someone throws out something that's just patently wrong about Christianity, about the Bible, about God, about Jesus, about humans, to challenge them, but in a way that's inquisitive, to go, well, what do you mean by that? Because I don't
Hmm.
believe that's true. So, now that I understand what you mean about that, tell me why it is that you believe that about the Bible.
Hmm.
What verses, what version of the Bible have you been reading that has led you to have that belief about God?
Right.
So that would be what I would offer is don't feel like you've got to get to a point of closing the deal, quote unquote, every
Hmm.
time you have a conversation about faith. And I would encourage you when you have conversations about faith, there is a time and a place to share what you believe, and I wouldn't shy away from what you believe. But I think it can be supremely helpful and fruitful to ask other people what they believe. Because really, it comes down to, as Christians, we have a worldview that makes sense. We have a view of our creation, about where we're going, about how we ought to treat other people, and where we derive our value as individuals that makes sense. And other people of other belief structures, atheists and believers of other religions, don't have that. And so I find it's helpful to kind of pick at some of the loose threads, kind of pick at some of the edges of those questions that people have, people of other belief structures, until you get them to a point where they realize that they have unanswered questions about their
Hmm.
own worldview.
Hmm.
And then you come in and you present the Christian worldview. I
Hmm.
don't, I think the reason that it can be unhelpful to sit down and go, hi, my name is so and so. I'd like to talk to you about Jesus, is because people think they have a coherent worldview that answers those four questions. Again, about who are they, where did they come from, what are they supposed to do, or how are they supposed to treat other people while they're here, and where are they going?
Yeah.
People think they have answers to that, and it's not until you ask the questions that reveal they actually don't have coherent answers to those questions that they're ready for an alternative. So stay curious, stay inquisitive in a respectful way, and I mean, because as you ask these questions, you're going to get answers that don't make sense.
Yeah.
So it's actually really easy to go, I don't think I understand that. Well, you explain it further, and you just keep asking, and they get to a point where it doesn't make sense, and you can go, okay, I don't think I understand that, but this is what I believe about it, and you can
Right.
actually offer something that does make sense. So I feel like I sound like a broken record player here, but stay inquisitive. Don't feel like you have to close the deal on every single conversation, and ask questions before you present an alternative. Because people are genuinely not open at the beginning to you going, here's Christianity, here's the Bible, this is why you should believe it. They need some prompting for them to understand why their own views don't make sense.
Start with care and concern for
Hmm.
them. And when they realize that you have a genuine care and concern about their experiences, about their thoughts, about their beliefs, over time, that will even open the door for you to share your own stories of God's goodness
Hmm.
and his faithfulness. And people can't argue with your own story.
Hmm.
But when you come at them with facts and statistics and you try to shove the Bible down their throat, that's when that wall will go up because it's not communicating that you care.
Hmm.
Blake, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and giving some real good practical ideas about how to share your faith. Friends, I think this is something that many of us struggle with, in part because we're afraid, in part because we think that we have to control it all the way to the end altar call,
Hmm.
so to speak. So I hope that there was something from today's conversation that encouraged you to be inquisitive about other people, seek to understand them, show that you care, and then dip your toe in the water, ask some questions about why do they believe what they believe, and pray that when you're the one who sows the seed, that God will water it and bring it to a harvest. And if there are other tips, tools, strategies, techniques that you have found effective in sharing your faith, we would love to hear them. We want to continue to grow in
Hmm.
our walk and our discipleship and evangelism to others. So share your comment below, comment on the blog that's to follow, because we want to know what's been helpful to you.
Kind of for one more insight about asking questions.
Absolutely.
So I think one benefit of asking questions that I didn't expound on earlier was that when you ask questions of people, even if it's someone that you feel has a superior knowledge of their faith or an intellectual understanding of the Old Testament or whatever, by asking questions, if you feel like you're getting in over your head, you can just stop asking questions and change the conversation. But it's when someone lobs an accusation about Christianity and then you try to defend it, you can't just walk away
Uh-huh.
from defending
Oh, that's good.
Christianity. So when someone throws something out there, when you start asking follow-up questions, if you feel like you get to a place where I no longer have the correct answers and I need time to regroup and research this and go find the answers, you can just stop asking questions. You can go ask questions about something else, like their plans for the weekend. You can disengage much easier when you start with the
Mm,
basis of asking questions.
that's really important. It's human nature to want to defend ourselves.
Right.
And as believers and followers of Jesus Christ, we want to defend him because we know what he's done. But I appreciate your by asking questions. If you get in over your head, change the topic.
Yeah.
They might even welcome it at that point,
Yeah.
but you've given them something to consider. You've given them food for thought, and I believe the Holy Spirit will continue to nurture that as he did with the young man that you had the conversation with.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see what happens if you get to see this side of heaven. But I'm
Yeah.
I'm praying that you do, that you hear that he's continued to search the Bible, the source of truth, for the answers to the questions that he still has.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's our goal. We want to point them back to truth. So, friends, I hope that you've appreciated this episode. We'd love to hear what has worked for you. And I would love to hear what other topics of conversation you want us to have here on your Hope Filled Perspective. It's always our goal to offer you a biblically based, hope filled perspective to the issues that you are dealing with today. Until we're again, until we're together again next week, it's my prayer for you that you have a hope-filled week.